Welcome to podcast number 18, the Cold War. We're going to focus on the Cold War from 45 to 60. We'll be talking about the Yalta Conference, Potsdam Conference, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, the creation of Israel, the Red Scare and McCarthyism, Ike, and the Cold War. So let's get started. So as far as why does the Cold War start? We're going to look at a couple things. Number one, we're going to look at the Yalta Conference, general distrust between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, differences in post-war visions, the German problem, and the Berlin airlift. So those are the things we're going to look at for is why does this kind of Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union happen. So let's get moving here. All right. When you look at the Cold War, the origins actually of the Cold War you can actually trace them back to when World War II was actually still being fought. Okay. At the Yalta Conference, you see the big three. You see Winston Churchill on the left there, FDR in the middle, and good old Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, on the right there. And they're meeting. And they meet, and they're talking about a couple things. Okay? The first thing they're talking about is when the war is over, it is agreed upon that there will be free elections in Eastern Europe. Now, that's important because Stalin's going to eventually go back on that agreement. They're going to agree to create the UN. And on the UN, they're going to have a Security Council where the goal is to keep peace throughout the world. Okay? And what FDR also does that's significant is he convinces Stalin to go to war with Japan 90 days after the war in Europe is over, which is kind of important because many people consider this perhaps a blunder on FDR's part, that we didn't really need Stalin's help to defeat the Japanese, and by letting Stalin get involved in that war, that allowed for him to get concessions in Southeast Asia. Okay. Another reason why the Cold War emerges is there's a general distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's not like they have a very friendly history. For instance, it takes the Americans 16 years to even recognize the Soviet Union as being a nation. We're obviously not fans of communism in this country at this point in time, and so there's going to be that. In addition to that, I think there's some distrust on the Soviet side that we delayed opening up a second front to take some of the pressure off the Soviet Union when they were trying to push back the German invasion. Instead of opening up that front immediately in France, the British and the Americans opt to go to North Africa and Italy. And also Harry Truman, who becomes our president at the end of World War II, he makes some pretty questionable statements in a newspaper suggesting that it's a good thing that the Nazi Germans and the Soviets are kind of tearing each other apart, that they're both kind of evil and, really don't care who wins kind of thing. And so that's going to lead to some distrust. And also, there are some issues with the United States refusing to give loans to the Soviets after the war. And so there definitely is a level of distrust between the two nations. Okay. In addition to that, the post-war world visions that they have for the world, visions for the world, I should say, are going to be different. I think we tend to really demonize the Soviets in America. We kind of look at them as being very evil people, and there may be some truth to that. But one of the things we have to remember is that the Soviets in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, they were invaded twice, each time they're invaded, they lose tens of millions of people. And so one of the main goals for the Soviets is kind of like never again. They want to protect themselves from future invasions. They've been invaded by Germany twice, and so they don't want it to be a third time. And so the Soviets are going to want to build these little buffer states. Like these states in the red over here, they're going to want these states to kind of be a shield from future German aggression. And speaking of Germany, the Soviets are going to want to see Germany turned into like a massive potato farm. I mean, they don't want to see Germany rebuilt. They don't want to see Germany industrialized. They want to see Germany crushed and utterly defeated. And so they want some revenge. They want some reparations. Whereas the United States, we're going to be like, no, let's rebuild Europe. Let's rebuild Germany. Okay, let's get back to the Woodrow Wilson vision of peace here. Let's get self-determination going on out there. Let's get decolonization. Let's get some disarmament going on. And so you're just going to have these very different goals between the Soviets and the Americans. Okay? In addition to that, Germany, post-war Germany, is going to pose a real problem. Okay? At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, it's very clear that both sides have different opinions on Germany. Okay, like I already said, U.S. wants to rebuild it, the Soviets want to punish it. There is some agreement on how to punish Nazis, so everyone agrees on that. And so we have the Nuremberg trials, which punishes the high-ranking Nazis there. But what happens in Germany after World War II is that it's partitioned. Okay, it's split up into 4 sections. The British get a section, Soviets get a section, the Americans and the French get a section. Okay, France was allowed to get a section as long as that section came out of the Allies' part. Okay, the capital city of Berlin, which is located in East Germany, is also split into sectors. Okay, and so eventually, I think we all know the story to this here. Eventually, Germany will get split into 2: a West Germany and an East Germany. Okay, it's also at the Potsdam Conference that Stalin is informed by Truman that the Americans had an atomic bomb, and many people insist that Truman told Stalin this in an effort to intimidate him to kind of get what he wanted. Okay, now let's fast forward a couple years. Okay, 1948, 1949. All right, Stalin does not want Berlin to be split. He doesn't like this idea that there's a West Berlin, okay? And so he wants to gain control of that city. And so what he basically tries to do is starve West Berlin, okay? And so he blockades it. He cuts off any access to West Berlin. And so what the Allies have to do to defeat this blockade is that the Allies have to land planes, and by Allies that basically just means the United States, have to land planes in Berlin to make sure that people there, don't starve to death and get all the supplies they need. And this goes on for about a year, and it's kind of like a battle of wills. And eventually, Stalin blinks and pulls and basically takes the blockade away. So it's kind of like a victory for the Americans. And you're going to see a bunch of silly little contests like this throughout the war. There's nothing too small to compete over in the Cold War. Okay, so anyways, Truman basically comes up with a kind of a policy towards the Soviets and communism, okay? And it's very much influenced by one of his advisors named Kennan, okay? And basically here's what happens. Greece is on the verge of a collapse. They're about to collapse to communist guerrillas, okay? And Truman's basically has to face a pretty big decision here. Do we let Greece fall to communism? And his answer is no. And so basically what the policy of the United States is going to become, which is going to be known as the Truman Doctrine or Containment, is that communism is evil and it can't be allowed to be spread. So we can't help the fact that communism is where it is right now, but we have to stop it from spreading. And that will now become the policy of the United States. And we'll be somewhat successful in that. We're going to in some cases stop the spread of communism, but in other cases we're going to fail at it. Okay? And one of the ways we're going to really make sure that communism doesn't spread in Europe is we're going to make sure that Europe is rebuilt and everyone's happy. And so we have the Marshall Plan that is created to send billions and billions of dollars to these European nations to help them rebuild and also just plain old survive. And by doing this, we're going to keep this idea of communism away. We're going to keep this idea of this new kind of radical economic policy on the back burner. And we're going to rebuild these countries and hopefully make sure they stay capitalist and also democratic. All right? So here you see a map of countries here. And based on how big the red bar is, that's how much aid they got from the Marshall Plan. So you'll notice that a lot of Western European nations got them, including former Axis nations like Italy and even Germany. What we also see happening during this period is we see both sides basically set up alliances. Okay, so we see NATO being formed in 1949, and this is something that the United States joins. So you can really see how times have changed. After World War I, we weren't willing to join a foreign alliance, but here we jump on into it. To settle the nerves of these Western European nations who are now facing this Goliath to the east, the United States steps in and says, hey, look guys, don't fear. If they attack you, they attack us. An attack on one is an attack on all. And so NATO is formed to protect all these countries from Soviet aggression and to stop the expansion of communism. The Soviets respond with what is known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviet Union joins the Warsaw Pact, as well as their buffer or satellite nations over here, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. we also start to amp up our defense spending, okay? Because once it becomes clear that we might have to go and fight these Soviets or at least intimidate them, it becomes very clear that we can't draw down our military from World War I, or World War II, excuse me. And so we passed the National Security Act of 1947, which creates the Department of Defense. That's when the Pentagon is built, and that's also where the National Security Council is created to advise the president. And the law NSC-68 allows the president to quadruple military spending. And we also have a peacetime draft that's created as well. Truman's policy of containment is put to the test in Korea when communist-supported North Korea invades South Korea. Okay, we send over troops, and long story short, we're able to stop the communist invasion. China gets in the middle of this as well, which makes things more complicated. But in the end, North Korea stays communist, and South Korea stays democratic. And so that's important. In 1948, another very momentous decision is made. The Jews are given a homeland of their own in their ancestral homelands in Palestine, and so Israel is created. Unfortunately, there are people there already called Palestinians who are Muslim Arabs, and they are uprooted. And what's going to happen in the mid-20th century and early and late 20th century, I should say, is that there are several wars between Israel and their surrounding Arab nations. And the United States is a staunch supporter of Israel. Okay, we're the first country to recognize them. We give them lots of weapons. We very much want to make sure that they are a successful nation, that they stick around, and they have everything that they need. And this is significant only because that our support for Israel has made a lot of Arab nations and organizations angry at America over the past couple decades. All right. So our last topic for the day is to talk about President Eisenhower, who's our second Cold War president. He serves for most of the 50s. He's not a huge fan of containment. He feels it's kind of cowardly not to go and liberate captive people. So he's going to have some different policies that he's going to put into place. Okay, one of his policies is known as massive retaliation. Massive retaliation being that we're going to use nuclear weapons to scare the crap out of the Soviets. So basically, if they mess with us, if they mess with our allies, we're going to just use our nukes on them. So nuclear weapons become a first strike option, which means we can have a smaller army with a smaller price tag. However, Eisenhower is going to find out that this is kind of a unrealistic policy, because you're not just going to throw down nuclear weapons over some little minor issue. Okay, they're a weapon of last resort. You can't just use them right away. And so this idea of massive retaliation is not going to last too long. Okay, Eisenhower also believes in what's known as the domino theory, which means that if one country in a region falls, you can assume that more countries will fall as well. And so that's why we see in Asia, for instance, when Vietnam appears to be teetering towards communism, we're going to freak out and we're going to jump in and say, no, we can't let any country go communist, because if that happens, more will come. Okay? Eisenhower also makes a commitment to the Middle East and keeping communism out of the Middle East with the Eisenhower Doctrine. Okay? But like I said, the massive retaliation policy doesn't really offer a lot of flexibility, because when the Hungarians revolt against the communists in 1956, the Americans do nothing to really assist them, because we're not willing to risk war with the Soviets or nuclear war with the Soviets. Okay? And what's really weird about nuclear weapons is that both countries having nuclear weapons kind of keeps the peace, because both sides are so terrified of nuclear war that neither one of them is ever going to dare think about fighting one another. And so this idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, means that the Soviets and the Americans are never going to directly fight one another, because if they did, it's too risky and it's too dangerous. And so what we see happening is that the Soviets and the Americans indirectly fight or challenge one another, okay, which is kind of interesting. All right, so moving on, we're almost done. I think I said that was the last topic before, and I lied to you. Almost done here. During the Cold War, in the 50s, we have our second Red Scare, where it's led by Wisconsin's best and brightest senator, Joseph McCarthy. Basically, during the 50s here, we have people freaking out once again that there's communists everywhere. We see the Rosenbergs accused of giving atomic secrets to the Soviets. They're convicted of treason and executed. And it's found out in the 90s that they were indeed guilty. But the significant thing was that during the 50s and during their trial, there wasn't any evidence that they were guilty. It was very wishy-washy. People thought they were guilty, but they really couldn't prove it. But the times show us that you only needed to kind of accuse people of this. We have HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. These guys go after Hollywood writers and directors who are suspected of being communist, and Richard Nixon leads the investigations. And this is where we have the Hollywood 10, these Hollywood executives who are questioned about being communists. These guys refuse to answer questions, though. All right, and then we have Joe McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator, who claims that he has a list of communists that are in the government. Okay, and there definitely were communists within our government. There's the whole Hiss thing going on, but for the most part, McCarthy was just kind of making it up and just going around accusing people. Okay, which made America more paranoid than ever. Fortunately enough, though, McCarthy goes ahead and accuses the army of being loaded with communists, and that's where people are like, "Dude, you're nuts," and he kind of loses his power. But for a short time, McCarthy was incredibly powerful, and was able to kind of do whatever he wanted. Eisenhower kind of stayed out of his way because everyone's kind of scared of this guy. Because if you got in this guy's way, he would be like, "You're a communist," and you'd be like, "No, I'm not a communist." So, anyways, we do have that kind of paranoia and red scare like we did in the 20s. So, anyways, that's all I have for you today. Follow me on Twitter. There's my class website where you find my chapter PowerPoints and the copies of these podcasts. Email me any questions and follow me on YouTube. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.